Chapter 16 of A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines by Clayton Edwards. Chapter 16. Henry Hudson. When James I was King of England, and 4 years after the death of the great Queen Elizabeth, there existed an English and Russian trading company of wealthy merchants, which was known as the Muscovy Company, an association of great influence that desired to extend its commerce to far-off China, whose wealth in those days was considered to be fabulous. All the maritime nations of Europe desired to gain the China trade and to bring to their own ports the rich silks and spices of the Orient. All of them were seeking for some quick and easy route for sailing vessels from Europe to China, and fortunate indeed would be that nation whose sailors first discovered such a passage. Therefore, in the year 1607, the Muscovy Company tried to find some sea captain who would undertake a voyage of discovery to find a quicker way to the Far East than around the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa. Now at that very time there chanced to be living a mariner named Henry Hudson, who commanded a small coasting vessel which was anchored near the mouth of the river Thames. He heard of the offer made by the Muscovy Company and offered his services, and partly because the merchants believed him to be a capable seaman, and partly because no other sailor volunteered for this dangerous mission, Henry Hudson was given command of the little ship called the Hopewell, and with a small crew set out to find the way to China by the northeast, hoping to skirt the northern shore of Russia and then sail south into Oriental seas along the Asiatic coast. Nobody knows today who Hudson was or what his life had been up to the time when he entered the service of the Muscovy Company. Over 300 years ago he suddenly appeared as a brave and capable sailor and explorer, only to disappear in the great bay in northern Canada that now bears his name, when he was deserted and left to certain death by a mutinous and cowardly crew. We do not know what he looked like, for no portrait of him has been preserved. We do not know who were the members of his family, for no records of them have been kept. All we know is that this master mariner sailed farther north than any other sailor of his day, farther north indeed than any sailor who succeeded him for nearly 300 years. And what is still more important, that he explored the great river now called the Hudson, on whose shore stands one of the mightiest cities of the world. The Hopewell was a little ship, about the size of the smallest fishing vessels of today, and had been used many years before by another great explorer and a friend of Sir Francis Drake's, named Martin Frobisher. That Hudson was able in this tiny craft to penetrate farther into the Arctic wilderness than the great square-rigged ships and the strongly built steamers of the 19th century is almost beyond belief. But the fact that he did so is not to be doubted, and the results of his voyages into these icy and deserted seas bore almost as great fruit as though he had discovered the passage to China that he had hoped for. First Hudson sailed north and then east to the coast of what is now called Spitzbergen, and after which he sailed along the shore of Greenland to the north. He tried to round the northern end of Greenland, but the great ice floes blocked his progress. Everywhere were icebergs and cliffs of solid ice, grinding against each other with a wicked roar on the great seas. And always was there fog born of the ice, or heavy gales that tossed the little Hopewell like a feather. After trying for many days to sail where no ship has ever sailed, Hudson finally gave up the attempt, and, bitterly disappointed, turned his prow towards England, where he reported to the Muscovy Company that great numbers of whales sported in the icy waters near Spitzbergen, a report that afterward resulted in the great whale fisheries of that locality, and untold wealth for the ships and companies that pursued them. But Hudson had done more than he realized. Not only had he reached a latitude of 81 degrees 50 minutes north, but he brought back important information that there was no hope of reaching Asia in the direction he had followed. The merchants of the Muscovy Company were disappointed, but they still believed that the passage to China could be found, and in 1608 Hudson set sail again, determined this time to find the great waterway that would make his name and fortune. But again he was doomed to failure, and returned with even less to show than on the previous voyage. He did, however, bring back a curious tale that added to the superstitious sea lore of those times, for two of his sailors, one morning, when looking over the side of the vessel, beheld what they declared was a mermaid with a white skin and a tail like a mackerel, long black hair, and a back and breast like a woman's. For a long time these mendacious mariners insisted the mermaid, who is believed to have been a seal, swam beside the vessel, looking earnestly into their eyes, but at last a sea overturned her, and she dove deep and disappeared from view. When Hudson returned again, with nothing to show for his bravery and daring, the Muscovy Company was not willing to fit him out for a third voyage. The fame of his exploits, however, had traveled throughout Europe, and he was summoned to Holland by a group of wealthy merchants, who asked him to try once more in any direction he saw fit, and in the interests of the Dutch East India Company. This time Hudson was to succeed, although in a way that he little dreamed of, and certainly a way that was far removed from the discovery of a sea route to China. In a little vessel called the Half Moon, and with a crew of about a score of Englishmen and Hollanders, he set sail on April 5th, 1609, with high hopes that at last he would find the passage he had so long and patiently sought for. At first it looked as though he was doomed once more to failure. After cruising for a month, he found himself in the icy reaches of the Barents Sea, and then the Half Moon was caught in the ice, and only saved from being crushed to splinters by a favorable breeze that sprang up just as the jaws of the ice floes were closing on the little vessel. So far Hudson had accomplished nothing, and his crew was dissatisfied and rebellious. They were unwilling to continue the voyage in the north, and desired a quick return to Holland. But Hudson knew that if he put back with another failure to his credit, his reputation would be lost forever, and he would never get another opportunity to engage in exploration. So, to pacify the crew, and at the same time to accomplish something that might meet with favor in the eyes of his patrons, he suggested that they sail for North America, and try to discover the passage through a waterway that lay to the north of the British possessions in Virginia. When the Half Moon was being buffeted by a gale off the coast of Newfoundland, the foremast was carried away, and Hudson sailed southwest along the coast of Nova Scotia, anchoring at last in what is now known as the mouth of the Kennebec River in Maine. Here his men landed, and sought a mast for the ship in the virgin forest that ran down to the edge of the salt water. Here, too, they met their first Indians, and treated them with suspicion and distrust. Hudson himself met the natives kindly, and always established good relations with them. But his ignorant crew, particularly his mate, whose name was Juet, believed that the natives were only waiting to do them some violence and treachery. And with this in mind, the sailors drove the Indians into the forest and plundered their wigwams, taking whatever was valuable back to the Half Moon. Hudson could do little or nothing to prevent them, for at this time the ill feeling of his men had grown to such an extent that he was only nominally in command, and had little or no control over his lawless followers. With a new mast in place, the Half Moon set sail from the Penobscot and bore away to the south, passing Cape Cod, which had been discovered a short time before by Bartholomew Gosnold, and continuing on a southern course until it reached a point beyond Chesapeake Bay. Then Hudson turned his prow north once more, and entered the bay itself, thinking that it might possibly be the entrance to the passage that he sought, but finding it too shallow for convenient navigation, he turned north again and sailed up the Jersey coast, coming at last to the mouth of a great harbor, which he thought, for a brief time only, might be on the way to China and the East. He found himself, however, in one of the most wonderful waterways of the entire world. There were many tribes of Indians around the shores, and these paddled out in their canoes with offerings of wampum and green tobacco, in return for which they received bits of glass and iron hoes and hatchets. They were filled with amazement at the appearance and clothes of the white men, and it was only after overcoming great fear that they dared to approach the Half Moon at all. But the suspicion and doubt of Hudson's crew, particularly of the surly Juet, again made itself manifest, and after many of the party had landed, some outrage must have been committed, for the Indians made an attack on the Half Moon with bows and arrows, killing one of the crew. The sailors built a barricade above the bulwarks to protect the men from further encounters, and Hudson proceeded up the harbor. He landed at the lower point of Manhattan Island and made a ceremonial visit to the Indians, who were doubtless of a different tribe than those that attacked him, for in that day there were many nations in the vicinity of Manhattan, some fierce and warlike, and others peace-loving and friendly. After exchanging gifts with the Indians and plying them with drink, whose unaccustomed sensations filled them with fear, amazement, and joy, Hudson continued his voyage up the noble river, anchoring at frequent intervals. More trouble soon occurred between his crew and the savages, for Juet the mate shot and killed an Indian who was attempting to steal some trifle from the cabin of the Half Moon. There followed a fight in which no less than 12 Indians were killed by Hudson's men. The redskins were getting their first taste of white man's rule, and coming with gifts, they were met with gunfire. What was more natural than for one of the ignorant savages to steal one of the amazing trifles that were displayed in the Half Moon's cabin? Death was certainly an unjust penalty. Up the river for 150 miles Hudson steered his course, trading with the natives as soon as he was removed from the scenes of the recent outrage. His writings show no surprise or delight at the wonderful scenery and the virgin forests and the giant river that he beheld, but it is a record of soundings, with an occasional remark that the trees would make good timber for vessels and casks, rich furs, green tobacco, and long strings of gay and polished shells, called wampum, were gladly exchanged by the Indians for bits of colored glass, beads, hatchets, and knives, commencing a trade that was later extensively carried on in the north by the Hudson Bay Trading Company, and at the mouth of the river by the Dutch settlers. At last the water became too shoal for further exploration, and Hudson returned downstream. It was time to conclude his voyage, and he consulted his men. They were greatly averse to returning to Holland, fearing without doubt that he would report their open mutiny and rebellious conduct as soon as they arrived. Hudson feared for his life, and indeed his fears were well founded, but with considerable astuteness he proposed that they return not to Holland but Ireland, a suggestion that was eagerly hailed by the crew. They set sail from Manhattan in October, and on November 7th arrived at Dartmouth, England, where Hudson had taken his vessel either through accident or design. He sent word of his arrival to the Dutch East India Company, and received an order to proceed to Holland without delay. But when he was about to set sail, the English forbade him to do so, and he was ordered henceforth to serve his own country and not to give help to a foreign power. Already, though he had little idea of it, he had accomplished more than enough to rank him as the foremost explorer of his time, and his name was assured of immortality. He had opened up to the advances of the Dutch settlers a country enormously rich in natural resources, and laid the primary foundation of perhaps the world's most wonderful city. He had established a farthest north that has only been equaled by modern explorers, and his voyages near Spitzbergen had resulted in profitable fisheries. But Hudson was not yet satisfied, and indeed his recent voyage had impelled the English to equip him again for further explorations. they gave him a little vessel of some 55 tons, named the Discovery, and a mixed crew of Englishmen and Dutchmen, with whom he put forth once more in 1610 to see if an opening into southern seas could be found by means of the waterways discovered by the explorer Davis. Among these sailors, to Hudson's cost, was his former surly mate Juet, and a young ne'er-do-well named Henry Green, who had been cast off by his family for his evil ways and his dissolute living. Hudson had befriended this young man, and had offered him a refuge in his own house, and now, to keep him out of mischief, took him along as a member of his crew. With the explorer also was a boy, John Hudson, who was undoubtedly his son, and who had served under him as cabin boy on previous voyages. That Hudson, for all his great qualities, was not a leader of men like the American Paul Jones, who could make convicts and prisoners of war serve him in battle against his enemies, and that he had always controlled his crew with a loose hand, seems amply borne out by the events that took place on this voyage, which was destined to prove his last. Almost before he had quitted the river Thames, he commenced to have trouble with his crew, sending one unruly member ashore before he was out of sight of land. He turned his prow towards Iceland, where he caught a great many fish and wild fowl, and where he and his followers saw Mount Hecla, the volcano, pouring flame upon the snows. He then set sail for Greenland, rounded Cape Desolation, and after a long and wearisome voyage found himself at last in the great body of water in northern Canada that is now called Hudson Bay. This, he thought, might be at last the long-sought passage, for the great waterway ran towards the south, and Hudson, sailing onward, found himself at last in the southernmost part, a pocket now called James Bay. Storms were frequent, and heavy fogs rolled upon him incessantly. On one occasion he anchored in a gale, and lay buffeting enormous seas for 8 long days. When he tried to hoist anchor, against the wishes of the crew, a great wave broke directly over the bow, breaking upon the deck with such force that all the men were swept from their feet, and several were injured. The anchor was lost, and only the quickness of the carpenter saved the cable, which he cut with an axe as it was running over the side. Staggering in the heavy sea, the Discovery sailed northward, for Hudson had at last become convinced that no passage led to the Orient through Hudson Bay. Ice retarded them, and they were compelled to seek winter quarters. Their provisions were nearly gone, and all that saved their lives was skill in hunting, whereby they secured several hundred white partridges or ptarmigan. Discontent and mutiny were breaking out among the members of the crew, and the ringleader against Hudson was young Henry Green, whom he had befriended and fed at his own table. A house was built for winter quarters, but it was badly constructed, and the biting Arctic blast swept through it, chilling to the bone the bodies that were weakened with hunger. In the spring, when the mariners were able once again to resume the voyage, they were at death's door from starvation. What little food was left was distributed by Hudson, and we are told he wept as he doled it out. Disappointed in his hopes of a successful voyage, weakened with hunger, and with a crew in almost open mutiny, it is not to be wondered at if he spoke harshly at times to his men, and added to the grudge they harbored against him. The most assiduous of all in their efforts to do him injury was Henry Green, his former beneficiary. A plot was conceived to put Hudson and all the sick members of the crew in the shallop, or small boat, that the Discoverer carried, and turn them adrift, and all the details of this were worked out by Green and some of the leading spirits among the mutineers. Hudson was seized and bound. The sick were told to get up from their bunks and take their places in the shallop. Even the boy, John Hudson, was placed there also, and the carpenter, who preferred to face death with his master rather than remain with the mutineers, was put aboard as well. Then the painter was cut, and without food, clothing, or provisions, Hudson and his companions floated away amid the ice fields. They were never seen again. The mutineers sailed homeward, and secured some provisions at islands on the way, where they found fish and wild fowl. It is a satisfaction to know that they were attacked by the natives, and that Green and several others were killed. The survivors, after a terrible voyage, reached Ireland, and then made their way to England. Although they were questioned closely regarding Hudson's fate, little or no punishment was visited on them, and some of them even took part in later expeditions. And so perished by base treachery one of the bravest and most brilliant sailors that the world has ever seen. For Hudson died either in the melancholy reaches of Hudson Bay, or on some bleak shore where he was cast away. But though he died miserably, he still lives, for his achievements are immortal. End of chapter 16.